Joining me now, an expert on this, much more than me, Dr. Matthew Spalding. He's the Vice President for Washington Operations at the great Hillsdale College. I'll probably be begging Dr. Spalding to allow my sons into his college one day. Okay, Doctor, George Washington's farewell address. It wasn't as simple, hey, I had a blast, thanks guys, peace. He really laid out some kind of directional things in it. Why?
Well, part of that, I think, is having to first go, and we can come back to this, have a general understanding about what Washington, kind of what his role was, and what was the significance of him being the first president of the United States. And we sometimes forget that. This was an experiment, as we often say, but Republican government, self-government, a constitutional republic, all these things we take for granted today. You have to understand, in 1776 and 1780, this was a totally new thing. Historically, it always failed in Rome and Greece. It had never worked before. And so his role was absolutely unique in what he did. And so he took everything seriously. So his first inaugural is a magnificent document, well worth reading. He also wrote something called his circular address when he was at the end of the war, when he was a general. He was also involved in a great potential conspiracy within his own military, which had great, massive implications for the rule of law over military rule. And then, of course, the farewell address, which you referred to, is probably his greatest state document. And there he took this very seriously. Remember, he had already been president for one term, thought about resigning then. They convinced him to do it again, so it was 8 years. And so he took the occasion to do what monarchs in Europe often did, which at the end of their rule, they make a grand statement about what they had accomplished. But the difference here is that Washington instead gives us, which is still worth reading today, this beautiful lesson, if you will, about what it means to be a self-governing people, what we have to worry about, what we have to preserve, both in terms of domestic and foreign policy. Very concerned about the character and morality of the people. He talks about the role of religion, very much emphasized the idea of independence as a nation in a world that's often hostile to Republican government. So in that sense, this is something that we have to put in the context of Washington, who clearly understood himself in a unique historical role in what was going to be a great nation in the world. And this was to be his greatest and his final statement, if you will, before he retired from public life and went home to Mount Vernon.
Doctor, now I'm not under the impression they knew America was going to get as big and powerful as it obviously did in the end, but they did know, or at least suspect, that they had something here, didn't they?
Absolutely. I mean, part of that, and Washington's circular address, which I referred to earlier, actually makes a very interesting point on this. At the end of the war had been won, and he basically told the public, we've won the war, now it's up to you to determine whether this nation will achieve its potential greatness. Part of that had to do with something with the circumstance. There were these 13 colonies, very fertile ground. They were separate from Europe, so they were relatively immune from many of the European politics. The economy had great potential. They were already a great trading partner with much of the world. So it actually, looking at it, assuming they could survive and they could defend themselves and not be destroyed by another European power, they potentially could be a great nation. And of course, the founders, all of them, but Washington in particular, they're all deeply steeped in history. They know their history of Greek republics and Rome. They know English history and the rise of the great English rule of law. Of course, they see themselves in that perspective. Why else would you go to the trouble of fighting a revolution and founding this nation? Yes, it was to survive. Yes, it was to get away from the British monarchy and rule ourselves. But of course, the purpose of ruling ourselves was to try to rule and be great, both in terms of our ability to govern ourselves and have a constitution and prove that Republican government is possible, but also create a country that will that will thrive and flourish and continue to exist and uphold these principles. So, yes, they had very, very high understanding of what they were trying to accomplish, and of all of them, I would say Washington had the highest. He understood the risk. He, of course, as general, had risked everything for this, and his character really pulls it through and holds it together when there's infighting in his presidency and other times. But he's doing it because he sees the possibility. And the possibility in the 18th century. This is a kind of the opening up this world where we're moving beyond the old world of monarchies and feudalism. The possibilities were really endless for this young nation.
Can you touch on the foreign policy aspect of that address a bit? That's probably my favorite part of it. I thought it was pretty telling.
Yes, of the farewell address. No, it is, and this is something that Washington is very concerned about. It's well worth reading again. Actually, it's well worth reading often. The United States Senate historically has it read once a year on the Senate floor especially because of its advice concerning foreign policy. And there's a great teaching that sometimes is misunderstood, but I think is extremely important. In short, Washington is warning us about the passions of foreign policy. Indeed, broadly speaking, the whole address is about his warnings about things that can get in the way of self-government. And at home and abroad, they have to do with the passions. At home, they have to do with controlling our own passions and being self-governing. So he warns, for instance, of partisanship and factions and the things we associate with special interest groups and things like that. When it comes to foreign policy, the parallel, if you will, is warning about getting wrapped up in the intrigues and the machinations of other powers, whether it be a power we hate or a power we love, and he's worried about both. So Jefferson famously loves everything French, and Hamilton, is very much drawn to the British and it hates the French. And of course, there's a war going on in the remnants of the French Revolution. Washington famously signs what is called the Neutrality Proclamation and says, we're going to stay out of it. However, it's not because he's what we might associate with isolationism, that is, we want to stay home and do nothing and twiddle our thumbs. It's based on an argument which I think is especially important with Washington, which we associate with the tradition of prudence, which is, look, our main objective here is to establish our institutions, the rule of law, uphold our Constitution, preserve and protect our people and its interests. All that is true. We're going to spread our message. We're going to uphold our rule. We're going to point out who we think is a just regime and an unjust regime. But that doesn't mean we have obligations to do that anywhere and everywhere. Indeed, when it's not in our interest, or it actually would be bad for our country, we actually have an obligation to not get involved. It's a prudential question. And in the time of the American founding, when France and England and Spain, all the great powers, are fighting with each other and getting caught up in wars, it is by no means in our interest to get caught up in that. So he says we must beware of foreign entanglement. Permanent alliances are always to be avoided. Temporary alliances are okay. But you got to think twice, and you got to think hard and think prudently about what all that means. And so today, in a time when we tend to look at politics, especially foreign policy, kind of as an ism, an abstract idea, rather than really putting it in practical context of how to think about it, the farewell address is an extremely good thing to read and let that weigh on us about how we think about things. I mean, our primary interest, our primary concern, our primary moral obligation are to uphold the American experiment in free government, which means our constitutional order, the rule of law here, defending our citizens, serving and upholding the moral principles of the Declaration of Independence. And that's precisely how we understood it. Now, if it's our interest to do things in the world, we of course will do things in the world. He had no qualms about that at all. But our primary objective in the world is to uphold and prove to the world and be a model to the world for Republican self-government. And things that we have to defend ourselves, we will, but we should be careful about what we do, because those things could well undermine our primary concerns, which is what we are trying to do more broadly. He says, which I always thought was a great line in terms of foreign policy, we must have a command of our own fortunes. That is, we must determine our own destiny. No one else should determine our destiny. That also means that we shouldn't determine other people's destiny. Right? Remember the Declaration of Independence, right? We have a separate and equal station in the world, but so do other countries, and we have to be. We shouldn't ignore that.
You want to watch our special on George Washington? It's freaking awesome. Well, you can. All you have to do is become a First TV supporter. That gives you access to all of our specials on demand, and it's cake. All you have to go to is thefirsttv.com/support. Thefirsttv.com/support. Become a supporter. Enjoy learning about George Washington.